Now to the U.S., President Donald Trump used his strongest language yet to condemn this weekend's racial violence. But for many, his denunciation was almost 48 hours too late, especially given what he said last year during the campaign. We'll hear about what he said today, but first, a couple of his past statements.
Anyone who cannot name our enemy is not fit to lead this country. We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides. Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything.
So a little bit of a contrast in some of the statements you heard there. So should we be surprised that the president was compelled to personally condemn extreme right groups? Kevin Boyle is a professor of American history, and he teaches at Northwestern University and joins me now from Evanston, Illinois. Thank you for being with us. We heard President Donald Trump came out for a second time since the violence broke out in Charlottesville, and this time he was actually being specific in his condemnation, the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and defining them as criminals and thugs. So some say that this may have been too little, too late, given that 48 hours has passed. What do you make of it?
I absolutely agree with that. I think it is too late. It doesn't take 48 hours to condemn what is profoundly anti-American politics.
So with the case that there has been quite a delay in him coming out and saying this, was it a result of all of the pressure that we saw really boiling up over the weekend, bipartisan criticism that we were seeing? Do you think he was bending to the pressure?
That's what I'm guessing. I don't know. Obviously, I don't have any insights into the inner workings of the White House decision-making, but it absolutely appears to be that he was responding to pressure. And I think this morning's, his very quick criticism of the African-American businessman who had criticized him.
And now, certainly during the course of the U.S. presidential campaign and then during the course of the inauguration and Trump's presidency, we've certainly heard criticism say that his campaign, his rhetoric has emboldened racism and racists in the United States. So is there any truth to that? Are we seeing a rise in white supremacy, or has it always been there?
There's always been white supremacist movements in the United States. There have been neo-Nazi movements in the United States since after World War II. There have been anti-Semitic movements in the United States. What's different is, at this moment, the extent to which those movements are moving into the public square.
And one of the factors that we often hear when it comes to these movements is that some people are blaming economic factors for the rise of people's despair and frustration, and saying that that might be some of the potential motivation behind some of these movements. Could it be that simple?
No, I don't think it is that simple. Yeah, sometimes people are drawn into extreme politics by their economic frustrations. Some of the people who are drawn into these white supremacist movements are undoubtedly feeling marginalized, but those people are making an explicit decision to act on their sense of marginalization by lashing out at other people, lashing out at African Americans, lashing out at Jewish Americans, lashing out at immigrants. That's a decision they're making. That's not purely a response to their marginalization. It's one response to their marginalization. If you take, for example, African Americans in the 1950s and 60s living in Mississippi or Alabama, you can't find a more marginalized group than African Americans living under Jim Crow in the 1950s and 60s. They didn't respond with this sort of demonization of other people. They responded with a movement that stressed the need for America to live up to its core promises. They made a different decision in their marginalization, in response to their marginalization, than white supremacists are making.
And, you know, there is something somewhat different when we're seeing this movement as it's surfacing now in the United States more recently. Is there somewhat of an image? Because we know that a lot of the protesters, for example, they weren't happy to see their images circulated, their photographs circulated on social media. So is there a difference now on who these white supremacists really are?
It's hard to know. It's really hard to identify who exactly are involved in white supremacy movements. I mean, they tend to be secretive movements. So it's hard to know exactly whether there's a switch in its base or not. But we're living in a different age. And I think if you're going to put yourself out into the streets with the sort of hatred they did in Charlottesville, well, if you show up on social media with your picture, tough luck.
And I just want to go back to the U.S. administration for a moment and maybe ask you what sort of responsibility the administration and the White House holds in this. And for example, we heard David Duke, the former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, supported a view suggesting that the Trump presidency actually supports these sorts of groups, these white nationalist groups. And actually, when he said on the march, David Duke said on Saturday, the day of the march, that this fulfills the promises of Donald Trump to take our country back. So where does that responsibility lie?
I think the responsibility of this administration or any administration is to fulfill the promises, the pledges that the President of the United States made in his inauguration, which is to defend the United States. And the United States core principles are being threatened by these white supremacist movements. And instead, I think what the president did during his campaign is he played to some of this sentiment. And now he has a profound responsibility as the President of the United States to resist this intrusion on basic American principles.
Thank you so much for your insights today, Kevin. Kevin Boyle is a professor of American history at Northwestern University in Illinois.